You are on your knees in the sand, and the sand is not just hot, it is alive with heat. It crawls into every crack of your skin. It burns your shins, your palms, the soft places where your knees press down because you are not allowed to stand. Your legs shake from strain. Your mouth is dry, not the normal kind of dry, but the kind that makes your tongue feel too big for your own throat. Around your neck is iron, not jewelry, not a symbol, but a collar with a bite. It is cinched so tight that every swallow feels like a mistake. A chain runs from that collar and links you to 11 other women, close enough that you feel them shift, close enough that you hear breath turn into sobs. One woman is crying without sound, like she has learned that even grief can get punished. Another whispers words that you do not know, a prayer in a language that still remembers her home. A shadow passes over your face and the sun disappears for half a second. The relief is instant. It is also cruel, because it vanishes just as fast. Hands seize your jaw. Fingers force your mouth open. You gag because your body still tries to protect itself, but the chain jerks tight and your body obeys the chain, not your instincts. A man presses fingers against your gums, your teeth, the back of your throat, as if you are not a person but a container being checked for cracks. He pulls your eyelids wide and looks at the whites of your eyes. He hooks a finger inside your lip and drags it down to expose you like livestock. He does not look at you the way someone looks at a human being. He looks the way a buyer looks at a tool. You do not know the rules of this place. Not fully, but you understand this. This inspection decides the rest of your life. For the man doing it, it means nothing. He will forget your face before the day ends. 12 days ago, you were the daughter of someone important in a village somewhere in the Sahel. You woke to your mother calling your name. You knew where the shade fell at midday. You had a name that meant something. Your mother is dead now. You watched her die. You kept walking anyway, because the men with blades made one rule clear without speaking. Stop moving, and you join her. There is a word in Arabic for what you have become, and it gets translated as slave girl, but that translation is too clean, too soft, too polite. What it really means is this: your body is inventory, your future belongs to whoever pays, and your past has been cut away like it never existed. Coins clink. A pouch shifts in a hand. Metal changes hands and you understand you have been sold again, and the road ahead is not a road to life, but a road to being erased. And the worst part is that this is not one isolated horror. This is the opening scene of a system that lasted more than 13 centuries, and the next thing you are going to learn is why it was built to leave almost nothing behind. This is the Arab slave trade, and if that phrase sounds like a single event, it is because history often gets packaged into short labels so people can swallow it without choking. But this was not short. It was not a burst of evil that ended quickly. It was a long machine, older than many modern nations, running across generations, passing from father to son, from merchant to merchant, from port to port. Historians estimate that millions of Africans were taken from their homes and transported to North Africa, the Middle East, and the Arabian Peninsula. You will hear numbers like 14 million, and you will hear ranges like between 14 million and 17 million. The exact count is hard because records were inconsistent, caravans vanished, deaths went uncounted, and paperwork does not follow people who are treated like cargo. But here is what matters even more than the number: the length of time. Systems do not survive for more than 13 centuries unless they are maintained, defended, normalized, and made profitable. This trade did not survive by accident. It survived because too many people made money from it, and too many societies built daily life on the idea that some humans could be owned. Most people already know about the Atlantic slave trade. They picture ships, chains, plantations in the Americas. Roughly 12 million Africans were transported across the ocean over roughly 400 years. That history has museums, memorials, movies, school lessons, and public debates. Leaders reference it. Communities carry memory forward because there are tens of millions of descendants who can point to their existence and say, "This happened, and we are the living proof." In the United States today, there are around 45 million people of African descent. Their communities keep the story alive. Their struggles make it impossible to pretend the past never happened. But when you look toward parts of the Middle East, after more than 13 centuries of importing millions of Africans, you see something different. A strange absence. Scattered small communities here and there, but not the vast visible descendant populations you would expect. And that forces one brutal question that historians struggle to answer without flinching. So where did millions of people go? Where did the descendants go? If you are still with me, stay with me, because the answer is not comfortable. It is not even something people like to say out loud. It is the darkest engineering choice inside this entire system. And once you hear it, you will understand why silence was not an accident. The answer is this. The trade was designed to prevent permanence. It was built to stop enslaved Africans from forming families, building communities, and leaving descendants who could remember, resist, or demand justice. And one of the most brutal tools used to do that was castration. This is not a rumor whispered on the edge of history. It is documented across many primary accounts across centuries. Enslaved African males were often castrated at horrifying rates, with some estimates claiming extremely high proportions in certain routes and periods. The procedure happened at specific points along trade networks, and survival was never guaranteed. People died from blood loss, infection, and shock. Think about what that means in human terms. Men captured in raids, marched across harsh terrain, then mutilated as a step in processing, like an animal being branded. To traders, it was cost. To the victims, it was the end of the body they were born with and the end of the future they could have built. And the logic was cold. A castrated enslaved man could not reproduce, could not form a family line, could not create a community strong enough to resist. He would work, age, and die, and then be replaced by the next raid. But the women were used differently. Women were often kept intact and targeted for fertility. Their bodies were valued not only for labor, but for forced sexual access and the production of children who would not belong to them. That is why the title hits so hard. For many women, what happened next was worse than death, not because death is small, but because survival meant a long life of violation, erasure, forced separation from children, and the destruction of identity so thorough that even their names did not survive. Historical records often hide this behind euphemism, careful wording, deliberate silence, because the details were indecent to record openly. But the silence itself is part of the violence. When suffering is too shameful to describe, the victim gets erased twice, first in life, then in memory. And here is the next turn you need to brace for. The trade did not rely on one group doing all the raiding. It ran through supply chains, incentives, and local conflicts that were fed and amplified by profit. So the question becomes, how do you keep a human hunting machine running for more than 13 centuries? You do it the same way any long business runs. You build an economy around it, then you make sure everyone has a reason to keep it alive. The system required constant supply, and merchants did not always raid villages themselves. Many were businessmen operating networks stretching across deserts and seas. They built markets, routes, and pricing systems, then created incentives that pushed others to do the capturing. Firearms and goods flowed into parts of the continent. Textiles, luxury items, metal, salt, resources that could be desperately valuable in certain regions were exchanged for human beings. Over time, some local powers became dependent on capturing people to trade. Raids became seasonal. Warfare became profitable. The logic spread like disease. More weapons meant stronger raids. Stronger raids meant more captives. More captives meant more buying power, and more buying power meant more weapons. It was a cycle that fed itself. People sometimes imagine slavery as a static condition, but this was dynamic, expanding, adapting, responding to demand. If demand rose in one region, routes shifted. If a port was pressured, transactions moved into shadows. The machine learned how to survive. When villages were attacked, it was often at dawn when resistance was weakest. Settlements were surrounded while people slept. Men who fought back might be killed immediately. Men who surrendered were inspected. Age, strength, health. Some were separated for labor, some for castration. Some were simply killed if they were judged to be not worth the trouble of transport. The women faced another calculation. Traders examined them with the same cold eyes used in markets. Too young meant years of feeding before profit. Too old meant lower price. And the ideal age range was often framed as the years when a woman could survive hard transport and then be exploited for a long time. Girls and young women between roughly 13 and 25 were treated as prime value. Appearance mattered. Certain origins were priced higher. Buyers in different regions had preferences, and those preferences shaped who was targeted and how they were treated during transport. Not because anyone cared about the woman's suffering, but because damaged merchandise lost value. And then came the moment that turned pain into a permanent wound. Families ripped apart. Mothers torn from children, sisters separated from sisters, husbands ripped from wives. These separations did not happen slowly, they happened in minutes. People clung to each other for seconds longer, then chains tightened and bodies were pulled in opposite directions. Witnesses wrote about screams that followed them for years, because the human brain does not easily erase the sound of a mother calling for a child who will never answer. And after that, the next horror was geography itself, the desert. Because once the caravan moved, compassion became a liability, and death became routine. The trans-Saharan routes were not measured in miles or kilometers the way tourists measure travel. They were measured in dehydration, in collapsed bodies, in bones left behind as markers. From collection points in sub-Saharan Africa to northern markets like Tripoli, Tunis, Cairo, and Marrakesh, caravans traveled staggering distances. Some routes exceeded 2,000 kilometers. Others stretched farther depending on political conditions, water sources, and control of passage. The journey could take roughly 2 to 3 months under ideal circumstances, but circumstances were rarely ideal. The Sahara is the largest hot desert on Earth, and daytime temperatures can climb past 120 degrees Fahrenheit. The sand can blister skin, shade can vanish for hundreds of miles. Then night arrives and temperature drops sharply. That swing alone can kill. When people are already malnourished, chained, and exhausted, the desert does not need to try to kill them. It simply exists, and that is enough. Water was rationed with ruthless calculation. Camels were expensive. Camels carried goods. Camels were the profit. Enslaved people were treated as replaceable. So water often went to animals first, then to humans, if anything remained. Lips cracked and bled. Tongues swelled. Throats burned with the kind of thirst that makes you dream of drinking and then wake up choking. Food was scarce. Dried dates, small pieces of meat, whatever could keep bodies moving but not strong. Death became constant. Historians estimate that large proportions of captives died during crossings, and in some caravans the losses were catastrophic. Those who collapsed were often abandoned. Stopping to bury the dead slowed the caravan. Stopping to help the dying risked losing the living. In a system built on profit, compassion was treated as a mistake. Over time, the routes themselves became marked by remains. Travelers described paths littered with human skeletons, skulls bleached white by sun, rib cages half buried in drifting sand. These were not ancient bones from some forgotten era. They were recent additions to trails that had been consuming people for over 1,000 years. And for the women who survived, who endured thirst, heat, cold, hunger, and terror, arrival at a northern city did not mean safety. It only meant the journey had ended. What began next was another form of violence, the market, where the body was evaluated, priced, and assigned a new life without consent. Slave markets in parts of the Arab world were ancient institutions, refined over centuries into systems of terrifying efficiency. By the time European observers documented them, some markets had been operating for generations beyond counting. Buyers arrived from across regions: nobles, merchants, household managers, agents for wealthy families. Markets were often divided by category: laborers, skilled workers, domestic servants, and areas where women intended for private sale were kept away from casual eyes. The most disturbing thing many witnesses described was not chaos, but calm. The routine had been normalized. The inspection process was methodical. Teeth were examined to estimate age and health. Skin was checked for disease, scars, flaws. Hair was inspected. Then the evaluation became more invasive, with women forced to present themselves in degrading ways, treated like animals being judged for purchase. Some written accounts were so explicit that publishers later censored them. That censorship is another kind of erasure, the refusal to speak plainly about what was done to women because politeness mattered more than truth. Prices varied by age, appearance, origin, and intended use. Some women sold for modest sums. Others, especially young women and girls from regions buyers considered desirable, could command far higher prices. In certain markets, women from parts of East Africa, including Ethiopia, were often described as highly valued. Value here is an ugly word, because it means the buyer expected decades of control. Those selected for higher prices might receive slightly better treatment during transport, not out of mercy, but because a damaged body lowered profit. Families were still destroyed. Identity was still erased. A woman might be renamed, her language forbidden, her religion replaced, her past treated like dirt to be scrubbed away. After purchase, outcomes varied by buyer. Some women were forced into domestic service with sexual exploitation layered on top. Others were taken into elite households, into harems, or into private quarters where they became status symbols and tools of power. And this is where people get confused by modern fantasies. A harem was not exotic romance. It was a controlled institution of ownership. It could be a place of constant competition, violence, and survival politics, where favor meant safety, and rejection meant punishment. A tiny number of women rose to influence, and history remembers them precisely because they were rare exceptions. For the vast majority, there was no influence, only use, exhaustion, aging, and disappearance. And now comes the part that explains the silence you see today. What happened to the children born from these forced unions, and how that process dissolved ancestry until communities disappeared? Because the system did not only control bodies, it controlled memory, and it did so generation by generation. In some legal frameworks, an enslaved woman who bore her owner's child could gain limited protections on paper. The child might be considered free, and the mother's status could shift in ways that reduced her risk of being sold. But on paper is not the same as in life. Enforcement depended on the household, the region, and the willingness of powerful men to follow rules that restrained their power. Before pregnancy, she remained property. Even after pregnancy, her safety could still depend on the owner's mood, the household's politics, and whether anyone cared to recognize her rights. And none of this changes the core fact: whatever intimacy occurred was compelled. Consent did not exist in the way modern people understand it. The woman's body was treated as a resource. Her identity was treated as an inconvenience. Over generations, children from these forced relationships were often absorbed into surrounding populations. They married into local communities. Physical features blended, languages shifted. Stories were not passed down in the mother's original tongue because the mother's tongue had been forbidden or forgotten. Names were replaced. Customs were cut off. African ancestry could dilute until it faded from view, and because many men had been castrated and prevented from forming family lines, large visible communities struggled to form in the first place. This is one reason parts of the Middle East do not show the same scale of descendant communities you see in the Americas. That absence is not proof something did not happen. It is evidence of how the system worked. It prevented permanence, prevented memory, and prevented visible descendants from existing in large numbers who could keep the story alive publicly. And the ending was not a clean moral moment where society stood up and declared, "This is wrong." There was no single emancipation proclamation echoing across the region. Change came slowly, often under outside pressure. Routes were disrupted. Markets shifted underground. Abolitions arrived late in different places, with some states formally ending slavery in the 20th century years, like 1962 and 1981. Not ancient history. That detail matters because it destroys the lie that this was too long ago to matter. For some families, it is within living memory, and yet the public memory is thin, because silence was always part of the design. So let's bring the story back to the woman at the beginning, the one whose mouth was forced open in the sand, because the final horror is this: we will probably never know her name. We will never know what her mother called her. And if we do not speak about it deliberately, the erasure wins one more time. Remember that woman in the opening knees in the sand? Iron at her throat, chain linking her to other women who are too exhausted to cry loudly. She might have ended up in Cairo, sold behind a screen into a private household where she cooked, cleaned, raised children who were not legally hers, and learned that refusal was punished. She might have been taken to Baghdad, Damascus, or elsewhere, where her body was treated as a right someone purchased. She might have been placed in an elite household, forced into the internal politics of a harem where women competed for survival under rules designed by men. She might have borne children who never learned her original language, never heard her songs, never knew the meaning of her first name, because that name was erased the moment she was sold. Or she might have died on the route, left sitting in the sand as the caravan moved on, her bones joining countless others along paths the world pretends never existed. And that is why the phrase, "worse than death," is not exaggeration for many victims. Death ends suffering. What happened to countless women was prolonged suffering plus disappearance. Their bodies were used, their identities were stripped, their families were shattered, and their memory was dissolved into silence. In modern times, there have been discoveries that hint at how many vanished without record mass graves in desert regions, remains of people with no markers, no names, no descendants who can claim them. When archaeologists uncover bones and can only say they were likely enslaved people who collapsed during crossings, that is what erasure looks like in real life. Even death does not come with dignity. And the reason so many people do not talk about this history is not because it is unimportant, it is because the system succeeded at burying its victims so completely that the world learned to look away. So if you made it to the end, do not let the silence do its job. Hit like, subscribe, and share this with someone who thinks they already know the history of slavery. And I want one comment from you that proves you were here. Tell me where you're watching from and answer this. When a system is built to erase people, what does justice even look like centuries later? And who has the responsibility to remember?